Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker.
Material to right.
Te maanga o te whare tēnā koe, tuarua ki ngā mema o tō tātou whare tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora koutou. And kia ora Papawai. I'm so glad you're here, it's awesome. For this, well, so it's good. We're doing another bill in the final part of the process of this bill, and although it's a small bill in some respects in terms of the trust, it's really important to be talking about the history of these places. It's a big bill, it's a big bill, this big, okay, this big. It's an enormous bill. It has an enormous impact, yeah, which is, although it might be small in size, it's the impact that counts. Mr. Speaker. So we're really pleased that I'm really pleased to stand on behalf of the Green Party to support this bill. And as you know, ko tarerua te maunga, ko rua mahanga te awa, ko Papawai te marae. So it is very nice to be able to talk about Papawai, where my family are from on my dad's side. My dad's side, actually, part of the Rangitukai Waho whānau from there. I will talk a little bit about the history of Papawai, and it's really great hearing others talk about that too in their own ways. I really appreciated Joanne Hayes and her kōrero about the history of the Te Kotahitanga movement in the Māori Parliament. I just want to acknowledge the buildings on that place, Hikurangi, which was first built in 1885, but it burnt down, was rebuilt in 1888, and is named Hikurangi, the wharenui there, because Ngāti Porou carvers came down, and it was a way of acknowledging and respecting their work. The wharekai there is Te Waipounamu, Aotea Te Waipounamu, and again is another way for those who were there at the time in the rebuilding process to acknowledge both North and South, and to find ways of bringing together both parts of the country, if you like, the North and South of the country, at Papawai as part of the kotahitanga philosophy, as part of that kotahitanga kaupapa. And so the whole marae is established like that, which includes the fact that the teko will face on the inside in order to promote peace amongst te iwi Māori. I just want to go through briefly some of the reasons for some of the proposals in the bill, or the provisions in the bill, and base it primarily on the submission of the trust boards, actually, that are crucial to this bill, the Papawai and Kaikokirikiri trust boards. The trust boards, of course, supported this bill because they had worked very closely with the member on its development. But it's also important to note that some of the changes they were making did come from very extensive consultation and communication with the hapu and iwi of the Wairarapa. And I think that's really important. So it's not being imposed, the changes that are in this legislation are not being imposed on the community there, but they are the natural consequence of a change in time, a movement in time, the change in the way that the church is responding to the needs of the community, the change in the way that iwi Māori themselves are thinking about themselves in response to the 21st century. So, sir, one of the big ones for me personally was the way that the beneficiaries of the trust were being described.
Order, I apologise for interrupting the member, but I just want to ask people in charge of the sound system to do a little check on it. I seem to be picking up over here at least some of the conversation from the two doctors on the middle bench of the National Party. And I don't know if it's coming through my mic or other mics. Joanne Hayes.
No worries at all.
It might be coming through Joanne's mic still.
Yeah.
Material Turo.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the original Act, as I understand it, the original Act referred to the provision of scholarships through this funding for the children of British subjects, children of islands in the Pacific Ocean, which is quite broad, but with a preference to the children of the Ngāti Kahungunu tribe, and then other Māori or descendants of Māori from the east coast of the North Island. And then the final category was the descendants of Māori anywhere across the country. So quite a big catchment, and very generous, I might say, very generous at the time. But the board did believe that it was important that those who benefited from the income from the Wairarapa lands were those who would whakapapa back to those Wairarapa lands. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach to take. It certainly is very common in general law around trusts that there is a close connection between the beneficiaries and the original settlers or the settlors, or those who own the land or the resources in the first place. So I think that was just a modernisation of this legislation. So it says, the submission goes on to say that in regards to Wairarapa iwi, the 1943 Act refers to a preference to Ngāti Kahungunu only and does not specify rangitane in that legislation, other than through a description of other Māori or descendants of Māori from the east coast of the North Island. So the Trust did actually undertake quite a significant review a few years ago. The review was designed to recognise that the rangitane descendants should also be entitled to receive scholarships in respect to the whakapapa of those whose tipuna were those who originally gifted the lands for the purpose of education. So there was an attempt to find a reason to reflect more directly rangitane in the provisions of the legislation. Whakapapa confirms, they went on to say, that tipuna who gifted the lands were descendants from one or more Wairarapa hapu, one or more Wairarapa iwi, which may not have been restricted actually even to Ngāti Kahungunu or rangitane. So the way the bill was previously structured could actually provide more constraints than was necessary and not really recognise the rights of tangata whenua on these lands, either the desire for those who originally gifted the land for education purposes to have a broad base for their descendants to receive the benefit, nor a proper recognition of tangata whenua. Because of course in those days, in 1943, they weren't really, the language and concept of who iwi Māori, hapu Māori were, of course, you know, it was not the same as it is now after many years of proper consideration. So in 2006, the board undertook a consultation process, and one of those outcomes was to look at what is the best terminology to use in this legislation. How do Wairarapa iwi want themselves to be described in legislation that is about them and for them, that is actually about the resources they have provided to help their kids now and into the future? And I think that's a very responsive and collaborative conversation to have, and moves away from that more paternalistic approach that used to be an inherent part of any law that was developed in this country about Māori. It was always very much about doing things to Māori as opposed to Māori having the right to have a say. So the terminology that they came up with was tangata whenua of Wairarapa, and this terminology, in their view, upholds the mana of an individual who has a whakapapa to the tipuna rangatira, thank you Mr Speaker, who has established historical kinship groups in the Wairarapa. And so the board themselves have embraced this term because they spent a lot of time and important time working with iwi and hapu in the Wairarapa for figuring out what is the best way for us to describe ourselves as opposed to other people doing it for us. So that has been reflected in the legislation. I think that's really important. And it might seem small, but there has been so many times, and now and then it comes up in settlement bills too, where iwi and hapu are having some provision forced upon them, and even the way that they are able to describe themselves can sometimes be imposed on them. And so, if we are to be a modern 21st century democracy that is genuinely collaborative, that recognises Te Tiriti o Waitangi and it's as a fundament for our constitutional status and our right to operate in this country, then we need to make sure that iwi Māori, whānau Māori, hapu Māori have the right to describe themselves in the laws that respond to them. It's a small thing, but it's a similar thing to kind of the right for us to have our names said and pronounced properly. It's that kind of core identity and core right to be deciders of how we identify ourselves and how others do so. So although that is a small matter, sir, to raise here. I do think it is a critical one, and it's one that we could learn important lessons from, and I thank the Trust for engaging in that process with whānau to come up with that as a solution, and I look forward to voting for this legislation in time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.